Good evening. Good evening. How you doing? I'm Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement here at the Pratt Library. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm going to start in about 5 minutes. Just a little housekeeping. Jason and Dr. K are going to speak for 45 minutes. If you have a question for Jason or us, you can right there to the microphone here.
You ain't got to be so bad, got to be so cold. This doggy dog is surely getting old. Got to have a Jones for this, Jones for that. This running with the Joneses, boy, just ain't where it's at. You're gonna come back around to the sad, sad truth, the dirty low down.
So,
Got you thinking like that, boy.
After the program, I'm going to bring Jason back to the meeting for 5 minutes.
She got the red hair on, gold hanging from her ear, melanin lady. She got a jig on strong. It's so good to be here with you. Somebody's gonna fall in love tonight.
Good evening. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am Deputy Director of Public Services at the Pratt Central location. This evening, we have as our featured author, Jason G. Green, and moderator, Karsana Wise Whitehead. Jason Green is a Maryland-born community organizer, attorney, storyteller, and entrepreneur. Green served as Special Assistant to the President and Associate White House Counsel to President Obama. advising on economic and domestic policy matters. Green co-founded Skill Smart, a company that reshapes how communities measure economic impact. And he is CEO of Evergreen Labs, where he supports visionary organizations working to expand economic opportunity and strengthen community. Green serves as trustee to the Pleasant View Historic Association and supports its efforts to preserve the historic site. His award-winning documentary, Finding Fellowship, explores the rich history of Quince Orchard and the fight to preserve its legacy. A graduate of Washington University in St. Louis and Yale Law School, Green remains rooted in the work of truth and justice, investing in stories that remind us who we are. He currently spends time between Maryland and Dallas, Texas, with his wife, Ruta, and son, Aiden. Kersana Wise Whitehead is the host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA 88.9 FM. She is the founding director of the Carson Institute for Peace, Race, and Social Justice, as well as a communications and African American studies professor at Loyola University. Please join me in welcoming Jason Green in conversation and Dr. K to discuss his latest work, Too Precious to Lose, a memoir of family, community, and possibility. But before we bring them out, I would like to bring to the stage Mayor Scott.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. And good evening, everybody. I am so excited that so many people are here tonight to celebrate Jason and this great and important book. Jason, I've known Jason for a long time now. We know him as a public servant, as a father, but also just someone who cares about people. But something that I know will resonate with so many Baltimoreans as someone also who's so addicted to my own ancestry and my own family's history, I know that this book will resonate because we all go through it. I've been really digging deep into my family's histories and legacy. Recently, actually, I was just told Jason this backstage, just last week, we had a national conference of health philanthropy in Baltimore, and in the crowd, I actually met one of my cousins who I've never met in my life. So imagine standing in the middle of the M.E.T. Bank Exchange and seeing pictures of your great-grandmother as a baby. We know the power of family. See, we know the power of legacy. We know what that means, Reverend. We know how that can empower the next generation to know where they come from and who they come from. And this story of Jason's family, their legacy, and what they built is something that will resonate with so many because we all, especially right now as we progress as a city, tackling so many historic things, seeing the progress and investment coming, we also want to honor those who have been here, those legacy residents, those families that stayed here, that have to make sure that they benefit from what's happening next in Baltimore. So I just wanted to stop by and say thank all of you for supporting my great friend and to thank him for continuing to be a storyteller, a truth teller, and someone that's helping us think about what we should do to honor those that paved the way and came before us. Thank you very much.
Hello. How are we doing? Good to see you all.
You want to grab your mic?
It is such a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much. Give yourselves a round of applause for being here. And can we give Dr. K a round of applause? This is the only African-American woman with drive time radio show in a treasure that needs to be protected. And I'm so honored that I get to have this conversation with her. She promised she's going to make me look smart. Thank you for being here, Dr. K. Appreciate
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here, and to everyone who's joining us virtually. This was a book that made me cry. And it's not just because I'm an emotional person, because I am, but I'm a Nana's girl. And this idea of thinking about our grandmothers, the link between our past and our present, and the grounding of that is what we're going to get into tonight. And I also want to take a moment and thank our sign language interpreters, and my friend Brenda's here, so I'm happy. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah. I have to thank those who are here in ministry and the work that they're doing. So let's start with a different place. Because what I want to talk about is you had this incredible career with President Barack Obama, our forever president. So I want to say that up. And I want to lift up our FLOTUS, as a beautiful, brilliant black woman. Absolutely. Yes, forever. But you were a rising star. But it was cut short when you heard about your grandmother, 95 years old, and she was on her deathbed. I want you to start at that moment, because for those of us who are Nana's girls and boys, to think that you get that call in the midst of an incredible career, and you say, I have something I have to do. I have to go and sit with her. Can you talk us through what it meant for you at that moment? It wasn't difficult, it seemed, to walk away because you knew where you had to be. But what did it mean to go to her bedside? What were you hoping to get from her before she ran on ahead to see how the end is going to be?
Oh, wow. What was I hoping to get from her? What a beautiful question. To set the stage for those that haven't had a chance to read the book yet, what Dr. K is talking about is I was 4 years into serving as Associate White House Counsel for President Obama when I got this call from my mother that let me know that my then 95-year-old grandmother was sick in the hospital. And what was so moving about that is it turned out that it was the same hospital that she used to take me to when I was 5 years old. Right? I had the luxury of, like Dr. K, I was a grandma's boy. I grew up at the bottom of a dirt road that my grandparents lived at the top of. And because my parents both worked, that's where I got dropped off before and after school. And so my grandmother volunteered at Asbury. It's where her mother had gone on. And so to stay close to her, to stay in service, she continued to volunteer there even after her mother transitioned. And so she would take me with her. And it was beautiful because she introduced me to this idea of service, right? I got to go off and serve in the administration and serve, so many folks, Doug Duncan, Mike Subin, a bunch of elected officials in Montgomery County and across Maryland, because she had showed me this example of service. Well, you can imagine being 5 years old, right? These rooms that smelled funny, they were dark, I didn't want to go into them, and my grandmother would be there beckoning me. And I'd say, I'm 5 years old, Grandma. Like, why do I have to go in this room? I can't save this person. And she would say, we're not here to save someone. We're here to serve someone. And that idea of taking yourself out of it, removing the ego that you're actually there to be in service to someone, was what moved me when I went back to go see her. And I wasn't there with her, right? I was there for her. She was the patient in that space. And so you talk about this decision. I don't even think it was much of a decision, Dr. K. Sometimes people frame it as courageous. I thought my grandmother had 6 months. And so this was not a fork in the road. This was a necessary and a must-do. To go and sit with her in the same way I watched her sit with people late in life, to give her the same gift of dignity that I saw her give other people, to offer her the same ice chip and the same daily devotional, the same distraction, the same service and love. The surprise that I didn't expect is that I went in when my grandmother was 95 years old. She lived until she was 2 months shy of 107. We didn't know that then. Had we known that, maybe I'd try and see what a second term looks like. It's sometimes good to not know. Right? It's sometimes good to not know, and so I'm so grateful that I didn't know so that I could have that time spent with her in service.
Which is the part I wanted to get to, the not knowing. Because so many of us, when we start thinking about our grandmothers, if you have the gray-headed grandmothers and the wisdom that they impart just in everyday living. I want to do something different because I want to start at the end of the book rather than at the beginning. And I typically start at the beginning.
Dr. K's
of
going
books,
off script, y'all.
But the end has this paragraph where you talk about how you unfolded the pink funeral program, your grandmother's favorite color. Ida Pearl Green was printed across the bottom in elegant type. I thought about all the times when I was a little boy, and she would lovingly guide my hand, pointing to the words in a hymn so that I can follow along. And just like she taught me, I traced the letters I-D-A with my finger. Can you talk about the grandmother who took your hand in hers, teaching you how to trace letters so the letters made sense to you on the page?
Dr. K's trying to get me to cry. I refuse. It'll happen. I'd love to, part of the joy of this whole process is getting to share my grandmother. A good friend of mine said, I didn't have a grandmother like that. I wasn't that connected. I didn't have those kinds of stories. I said, you get to borrow mine. She's there for all of you. You guys all have John Dillow, who's in the back, who I worked with for a decade. We talk about Grandma Pearl, and she's your grandma too. This is a woman, one of the most sort of profound things about her, illustrative of who she was. She couldn't sleep at night. She would have insomnia, and she would say, what a wonderful opportunity for me to pray for other people. And it's a practice that I've adopted. I encourage you to adopt it, right? This opportunity to connect on that plane with someone else. In a moment that we're often frustrated, she would choose to think about and love other people. When you talk about tracing the finger, what comes to mind is when we would be sitting in chairs like the ones you're sitting in church, in pews. My dad was the pastor, right? My dad was the Methodist preacher, so he'd be up preaching. My mother was the head of Sunday school, so she'd be in the other room, and so I would sit next to Grandma. She'd keep me tight. And anytime I started to distract, she'd pull me back. But I would watch her with the hymn book. And she'd open it up, and she would lean down, and she would show me the words across the hymn. And then she knew her hymn so well that for that last verse, she and Miss Emma Jackson, who sat on the other side of the aisle, would race to see who could close their hymn book first because they knew all the words. And that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to emulate Grandma. I wanted to know the stories. I wanted to know the scripture. I wanted to know the hymns well enough that I could close my hymn book and sing along. And so I'm just very grateful that I got to spend the time that I did as a young man by her side, and it allowed me to see it again, right? I knew what I was looking for. I saw that reflection when I got to sit with her again later in life.
I want to draw a connection between Mrs. Ida Pearl Green and, of course, President Barack Obama,
Okay.
who I could spend all night. I have so many questions about someone who sat so close to him. But you talk about a special moment in the book, which is incredible to think that you can take your 90-plus-year-old grandmother to meet the first black president. What an incredible honor. So can you talk about taking her? There's a whole story around how she's trying to get up from a wheelchair, and he's saying, you don't have to get up. And she's like, I'm going to get up anyway because the president can't tell her to sit down. The back and forth. Right. But what was it like to connect the work you were doing, the historic work, because you knew that, and you talk about what it meant to work for President Obama, to bring your grandmother to meet her, to be in the presence of the history she'd probably been praying for all her life?
I didn't think about the significance of it until being in that very moment, right? And that was the day I had to go to work. I was at work that day until I saw my dad wheeling my 95-year-old grandmother up the West Exec Drive. I was like, oh, this is not just every day at work. This is a different day. And I was emotional because I knew it was the end of my tenure with the administration. When you leave the White House, you get to take a photo, the departure photo with the president. And usually you get one or two people to be in that photo, and I somehow snuck 8 people in. And so I had my parents and my sisters and my nephews and my grandmother. And it was so beautiful. The moment that Dr. K's talking about was my proud grandmother, right? Was not yet fully committed to a wheelchair. It was being used for expediency. And so when she wheeled up to the president, she tried, as a proud woman, get up and shake his hand. And so there was this awkward moment where she's trying to get up and he keeps pushing her down because he doesn't want her to hurt herself on his watch, right? That's a case that I would have had to handle in the counsel's office. Like, nobody wanted that. And so it was really beautiful to see this push of war. It was also beautiful, my little nephews who were 2 and 5 years old, looking up at him, understanding the significance of that moment. Right? There's a story that's in the book about my little nephew right before we walk in there, where he's running around the outer oval, right? And he's getting a little rambunctious. And I go over to him, I'm like, hey, bud, I need you to be on your best behavior today. He goes, where are we? What is this? I said, you know where we are. We're at the White House. He's like, Mommy says we're going to meet your boss today. I said, yeah. He goes, is President Obama your boss? Yeah. So are we going to meet President Obama today? Yeah, bud, we are. Without me having to push the issue, he goes, I'll be good. At 5 years old, he understood the significance of that. And there's a picture that just captures the joy in their little black boy eyes looking up at the president. Like, that's the joy, the love, the hope. Like, that's what we miss, right? That's what he brought. That's what it felt, trying to connect that work to my family. My father, who had made it his life's work to try and build community, foment community through his church. And then this man who had tried to build community at the national level and like really trying to bring those two together was something pretty special.
I want to ask you, as we go to the author's note, so the book starts in 1967, because you start with Dr. King. And you're asking this question that Dr. King asked, where do we go from here, chaos or community? Can you talk about the author's note, because you actually lay down some of the things that you're concerned about. In fact, you know what? Why don't you open it? And why don't you share that with us? Because you talk about all the worries that you have framing this moment, and then you tell us what you choose. So if you could do it in 2 pieces. So if you can read out to us when you talk about worrying about choosing community, which is that last sentence, and then help to frame how you then move from being concerned about choosing community to saying, but chaos is not the way.
So read the author's note. Too precious to lose, author's note. In 1967, Dr. King in his final book asked, where do we go from here, chaos or community? For the longest time, I assumed the answer was obvious. Community. We would choose one another. We would build and progress together. That was what I was taught and grew up believing. But now I understand why Dr. King posed his prophetic question, and I worry. I worry about the rising tide of racial and political animus and how easily it turns us inward and on each other. I worry about a future rushing toward us, widening a gulf between the haves and the have-nots. I worry that profit eclipses humanity, dignity, and respect. I worry because it matters how we see each other and that we see each other. I worry because choosing community isn't as obvious as I once perhaps naively believed. Alas, almost 60 years later, most signs still point to chaos. I get it. Chaos is faster, it's louder, it gets more clicks. Community moves slowly. It demands more of us and requires grace and intention. This book is about that kind of work, the kind that makes us slow down and truly remember. It was unexpected to walk into a room to sit by my ailing 95-year-old grandmother's side, a blessing to walk out forever changed. I wrote this book as an enduring reminder that our collective yesterdays, no matter how troubled, light our path toward better tomorrows. I choose community because some things are too precious to lose.
So in thinking about that, and thank you so much for reading that, we're at a moment now to just take it to the present and then go back into the book, where community is something that people seem to consciously not choose. They're choosing the individual over the collective. They're choosing profit over people. They're choosing chaos over peace. As someone who worked within an administration that seemed to be focused on trying to bring everybody to the table, we're in a moment where it feels like the table is only set for one, and the rest of us are designed to hold up the table. Can you talk about what community looks like in this moment and how you're trying to make that happen through this book?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When I think about what Dr. King wrote in '67, where do we go from here, chaos or community? What I felt when I saw that was that there weren't enough examples of community. Dr. K, what you're saying is there's plenty of evidence of chaos. There are plenty of examples of chaos, but where's the record on community? Where are the examples that we can point to? Where is the hope? Where people need to see it. My Uncle Tompkins would say, even people of faith sometimes need to see it to believe it. And so I wanted to introduce into the record an example of what community can look like. Frustrating, slow, backwards, forwards, right? Incomplete, but what it could actually look like and its value to move forward. And so one of the things that I hear a lot as I've been talking to different communities around the country is this exhaustion, right? What you're talking about. This feeling that the table is set for one and we're designed to not participate. Well, first it's important to show that that's by design, right? The chaos, the disorder, the polarization, the disorientation, that is by design. The chaos. And because what happens in chaos is we retract. We move to our corners. We try and protect what's ours. We say, I can only control what's in my four walls, and I have to let go of everything else. And that is the division where others win. That's where chaos wins, right? Where we pull back and we say, I can't worry about your problems right now. I can only worry about my own. And we're in this moment where people feel like the pendulum is swinging. And it's just inevitable that the pendulum swung towards progress and is now swung towards backlash. And that their exhaustion is inevitable. In that moment of backlash, we can feel exhausted. But I would argue that in reality, our progress comes from moments of despair. And so in these moments of despair, the question becomes, how can we, the opposite of chaos is not control, it's community. How can we actually engage in the connection and the community building that we need to build something out of the despair? When we look back through history, my family story being one of them, they built a community out of despair. It was out of enslavement, right? The free black community that it became Quince Orchard exists because of what happened, pre-1865. But it only happened because of the planning, because of the intention, because of the work, because of the preparedness, because of the marching, to then take advantage of a catalyzed emancipation. And so the question becomes, in these moments of despair, which we are in, for us to actually engage in the progress, how much are we willing to work? How much are we willing to sacrifice? How hard do we want it to actually build those elements of connection, to move past the individual, to really build those communal spaces?
Well, you lay out a pathway in your book, and I'm looking at the conversation, I'm on 58, 59, where you're watching a conversation between your mother and her mother. Some of the questions intrigued you, like what is it like being a single mother so young? Some of the questions don't, which is around the recipe for sauerkraut, which I have no idea why you have a problem with that, and brown sugar.
It turns out my grandmother's secret recipe for everything, or secret ingredient, was sugar.
Was sugar, which is very Southern. But there's something here in what your mother was doing that I think might get to the heart of how you build community. It's, even though you note that your mother knew the stories, she waited patiently for her mother to tell them again and again. And so can you talk about just the process of storytelling, which is what is a through line through here, that doesn't just connect you to your past, but it connects you out to others?
Oh my goodness, the storytelling point is so important. And you think about it even in the faith context. We tell the story, right? Every Christmas, every Easter, we tell the same story, but you have to keep telling the story because it may fall anew on the spirit, right? And that's what you're talking about with my mother and my grandmother. They engaged in this back and forth that really moved me. The first time I went into my grandmother's hospital room, my mother was asking my grandmother stories she already knew the answer to, but was giving her a chance to tell those stories, to hear them again, and for me to hear them, right? To know that they had a spectator there that was going to benefit from it. When I left the administration and sort of took up residence with my grandmother and started doing this every week, hearing these stories, I was so moved I went and found my older sister, Keisha, a couple years older than me, and I said, Grandma has all these stories about where we are and where we come from and who we are and whose we are. Did you know these stories? And she said, yeah. How didn't you? Gut punch, right? My sister had made the time. She had gone and sat at my grandparents' table every morning before school and heard the stories on her way to school, had breakfast with them. And by the time I came along, it was the last place I wanted to be. Boy, I was sitting at my grandparents' table. But to your point, she heard them over and over and over and used them as fuel, personal fuel, to move her forward. She understood their story of resilience and where they had been, and she understood who she was and who she was. And so it was really necessary for me. I'm grateful that my grandmother was willing. I was scared when I went into the hospital room that she wasn't going to be able to tell me those stories again. And so it's really a treat. I'm deeply fortunate that she was still capable to tell those stories, to give me that same fuel, to give me that same understanding of where I'm from.
Now, one of the things that I hated was disappointing my grandmother. Again, I looked for the moment of pride coming from my Nana's eyes more than from my mom and dad, who I loved, and I still love them very, very much. But my Nana, there was something about sitting at my Nana's feet. Well, there's a story in the book that both concerned me and made me laugh, because in one fell swoop, you disappointed both your grandmother and President Obama, like at the same time. So this idea, which is hard to do, but can you talk about that? Because that was a reckoning moment from you where you actually left that whole business of disappointing both. You said, I'm now leaving from Barack Obama. I have to figure out who I am now. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that disappointment and what it meant to your grandmother that she was looking for something very particular, but you didn't give it to her in that moment?
Dr. K's talking about this moment back in the Oval Office. It's surprising that I didn't anticipate this moment. I'd brought my whole family in there. I knew what I was going to do. We get to the end, and President Obama does what I'm sure he does with every staffer before they leave. He says, "So grateful. Thank you to the Green family for lending us Jason. Did good work. And we know he's going to contribute greatly. Jason, where are you going? Where are you going to go?" And he looked at me, and I had not anticipated that moment. And I can't say I'm going to go sit by my grandmother's bedside because she wouldn't allow it. We hadn't told her that I was leaving the White House to go sit with her because she fundamentally believed, and turned out to be right, that she would leave that bedside. And so in that moment where the President of the United States turns to me to say, "Jason, what are you going to do?" I said, I'm just going to go take a little time off. My grandmother at that point had been an Avon lady for some 60 years without taking a day off. President Obama at that point had been president for like 5 years without taking a day off. And he said, "A day off?" He said, I want a day off. And my grandmother looked at me so disappointedly that I was taking a day off. And so I ushered my family out of the Oval and then circled back to the president and said, "I'm going to go spend time with my grandmother." And I reminded him that he had done that on the campaign before his grandmother passed away. And he gave me sort of the last bro hug, which I savored, and he sent me on my way. And I needed to find out who I was without Barack Obama's name behind mine. It had become a parlor game in Washington, D.C. Who do you work for? What do you do? And I'd let everybody else go first because I knew I was going to say, and I work at the White House, and drop my Trump card on them. And I know, well, there you go. Yeah, fair enough. Oh, drop the Obama card on them. There you go. And so it became important, right, to figure out after 6 years, 2 years on the campaign, 4 years in the White House, who I was without Barack Obama behind me.
Which begs the next question, which is out of the book for just a moment, because how do you let that moment go by? You just said you were going to figure out who you were outside of the White House. You could no longer drop the Obama card. I won't say Trump card. You will no longer drop the Obama card, which of course stops all conversation if you say that's where you work. In this time, you have become a completely different person. I'm thinking about writing your family's story, sitting by your grandmother's bed, getting the stories that she told your sister, one as a doctor and one who was actually finishing up her residency, if I'm not mistaken, when they met the president. You've become a filmmaker. Like, you have a whole different career path that started because you were getting and sitting by your grandmother's bed and getting her stories. So can you talk for a minute about how this entryway into sitting by your grandmother's bed actually opened up a different life for you?
What it revealed is just the lineage that I was a part of. My grandmother was a storyteller. Right? My grandmother was a community builder. I just didn't fully appreciate it. I didn't see it in that context until I'm sitting by her bedside and started digesting the stories. I wanted to build communities. Well, it turns out my great-great-grandparents founded a community in 1868, right? And so I started to understand these things that you think that you're creating, that you think that you're trailblazing. In reality, we're continuing the legacy of those that have come before us. And so I think that there's the beauty where the ancestors are calling you, and we're all being called. And I got to slow down long enough to hear that call. Like, life is busy. Renee and I were just talking about this today. Life is so busy that it's rare when we get to truly slow down and appreciate, hear a story, internalize a story, understand someone's story. Like, part of what my grandmother's brilliance in this process was we would have a conversation and she would hear me perk up on one part of it, and she would say, if that part of the story interests you, well, you should go talk to Miss Johnson or Miss Blair or Dr. Howard, and kick me out of her hospital room. And I would go and sit with all these different members of the community, understanding how a history doesn't exist with one person. It's a collective and a shared history, sometimes in conflict. But it forced me to really sit with the elements of my history that I understood and agreed with, and the elements of my history that I didn't know or disagreed with. But it made me fuller, and it also showed me that I then had a responsibility, right? An opportunity, but then a responsibility, right? This idea of too precious to lose is, once you understand what that is, the question becomes, what are you willing to do to preserve it? And so unexpectedly, I became part of my family's, curator of history. Unexpectedly, I became my family's, author, along with my sister, who also wrote a book inspired by her time with my grandmother. But that wasn't by design. That was understanding sort of responsibility's call.
Can you talk a little bit about the community? Because what you have, in addition, of course, to being an author and storyteller and writing down what happened in your family, you also have an incredible opportunity here where you traced your family's history. Going through, because you had the church, you had the community, you had things at your fingertips that so many Black folks don't have when we're trying to tell our family's story. So can you talk about the process of that, and then about the community that kind of unfolded in front of you?
Absolutely. So the community we're talking about is Montgomery County. Tenge here and I grew up together, went to high school, middle school, high school, law school together. But what neither of us knew growing up there was that there was once a community called Quince Orchard. Right? We grew up we thought Gaithersburg. Now if you go out there, it's called North Potomac, so it's going through its own evolutions. I'm not sure how I feel about that. We can talk about that later. We can have a whole session about that. But But one of the things I've found that happens with the way that we preserve our history and sort of collect it and even tell our history, it's in these sort of breadcrumb ways. Right? We got to go and collect the breadcrumbs. We put a little bit of history on a school name. We put a little bit of history on a street name. We put a little bit of history, and so you got to go and start pulling the threads. And so I went and started pulling the threads of Quince Orchard to understand what this community is and my family's role in it. I wanted to understand, part of the story that was told was this very neat story about our great-grandparents. Right? We had great-great-grandpa Gary and great-great-grandma Matilda. Gary was an aspiring carpenter. Matilda was a homemaker. They met in Quince Orchard and had a family, and there you go, beautiful story. I was like, this was the 1840s. Well, there's some other pieces here that are being left out. And so we started pulling the thread to understand if slavery was a part of that story. I grew up, I don't think we ever heard a local lesson about slavery in Montgomery County. We heard about Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, like slavery happened on the Eastern Shore. Like what was the experience in Montgomery County? And so I went to my grandmother, my oracle, who knew everything. Her words were divine. Grandma, are we descendants from slaves here in Montgomery County? And she said, no, baby, slavery didn't exist in this part of Maryland. And I started marching out the door like, oh, okay. Then I hit that threshold and I was like, wait, what? But it's kind of amazing how she then said that generation didn't talk about those things. She said it was too hard for them to talk about. And she had then created her own story to fill in the gaps, which is just important to realize, like what we do to tell a story that aligns with kind of our vision of the world. And so I went into the stacks, and we're deeply fortunate just because of the way Maryland's situated. The archives in Annapolis have a really robust record there. Because we were afraid that the state would secede, there was the promise of reparations to slave owners. And so to actually get your reparations, you had to show up. You had to get a full list. You had to give names. You had to give ages. And so there's a pretty comprehensive list that exists in Annapolis called a slave census. And so I found that, and I started digging. And it turns out that the slave story I expected to unearth in maybe Montgomery, Alabama, existed in Montgomery County, Maryland. And not in a far-off part of Montgomery County, Maryland, a mile away from where I grew up. Is where my great-great-grandparents had been enslaved. And so I was very afraid, Dr. K, of sharing that information. I didn't know, my grandmother had this version of history. And then to say, no, not only is that version of history wrong, but this is our descendant path. And the land that you grew up on is also the land that 3 generations ago our family was enslaved on. Like that was when we talk about like trying to address and approach history, that's what I was trying to figure out. And so we did it in this way that I didn't expect, and I should have expected, because my grandmother, this is a woman who you would ask her, what's the hardest thing that you ever had to go through? And she would say, baby, if you believe in God and work hard, like what's hard? And so in dealing with that history, she turned it around. She talked about what great-great-grandpa Gary and great-great-grandma Matilda were able to build from enslavement. She talked about the legacy that they left. She talked about the values that they instilled. And so it's truly what I take away from it is like her beautiful orientation, but it is a resilient story. Ours is a resilient story that we need to learn from in these chaotic moments.
I want to just ask you for a moment to step into what you just said, because we're here on the eve of Juneteenth. Later this week, we're here on the eve of the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, at a time when we're rethinking what I would argue is the ongoing question about America. Who does America belong to? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because the argument over history is really about the fight over memory, about who gets to stand in the center of the story. They always say if the lion ever tells a story, man is not going to turn out very well, right?
The hunter looks bad, right?
Hunter looks bad. So can you talk for a moment about why, at this time, people really need to be more connected to their history, and they need to do the work to fill in the gaps.
Absolutely. I mean, this is my public service announcement to everyone, that I was lucky to get a call, literally a wake-up call to say, time is ticking. You got to go sit with your grandmother. Well, this is your call, right? A lot of people say that they wanted to go and do that. And whether, the individual had the stories, had the pictures, had the recipes, too often that person passes on without that opportunity. So you got to go do it with the next person. You got to find the furthest back memories you can and bring a couple of people together. You don't have to write a book. You don't have to make a documentary. Like, we can lessen the pressure. But it's really important that we sort of expand the history, right? That's what the value that Dr. K is talking about. Is we tell our history in these sort of individual iconic moments. Case in point, I learned about school desegregation. You ever heard of the Little Rock Nine? I heard about school desegregation in Little Rock, but I never learned that my father integrated my elementary school. Right? Like, that's a powerful conversation, and it puts it so present in time. It was taught long ago and far away, but to make it present and to make it personal is what's necessary in these moments to allow us to own our story. Right? I chaired Montgomery County's Commission on Remembrance and Reconciliation. The whole focus was to try and tell the story of racial terror. There were racial terror lynchings in Montgomery County that never got talked about, were not part of curriculum, etc. And what we realized is that the history is incomplete. The history was wrong. And so we had a responsibility to actually rewrite the history. And that's what, this is present right now. We don't have to learn something, we're actually writing anew. We have an opportunity to engage our history, to tell a story that actually influences other people. And I think it's important that we tell that story in a way that's big enough and broad enough for people to feel connected. We're in the midst of preserving the heritage site that my family founded in 1868. This weekend, we're going to reopen it. It's 158 years old. And during COVID, it had fallen into disrepair, and so we've invested a lot of dollars and love and energy to shore up the foundation and put the new steeple on. And the demographics of that community, Dr. K, have changed dramatically. That site has been preserved for 158 years by a trustee board who's been interested in protecting it, preserving it by protecting it. And now we're trying to preserve it by promoting it, preserving it by telling the story. Right? What we talked about, Dr. Hathaway. How do you tell a story that's big enough and broad enough for people to feel connected to invest in that story? And that's what I think with the opportunity that we have to tell our story in new and different ways.
I want to take you to a story that you tell in the book before we open it up for questions in the next 5 minutes or so. But over on page 99, you talk about a moment from your childhood when you were walking along a dirt road and you were called the N-word. And that the question that you have at the end of page 99 is, do I belong? Because they kept yelling, you don't belong here. So can you talk about just that moment? Because for many of us, we remember that first time that someone called us the N-word, particularly if you're like me and you're from the South, like you remember that time. But you had a bigger question around, do I belong? Can you talk about that just a moment?
I'm just going to read this paragraph, actually. His words had been frenetic, but he eventually found his refrain. You don't belong here. He repeated it again, growing louder and getting into my face as if the intensity alone would make it real. You don't belong here. The irony on a street that my family had literally named. My family had named this. I grew up on a street called Fellowship. It's the irony of that story. I grew up on a dirt road. It's the picture at the bottom of the book. That's the dirt road that I grew up on. And my grandfather's pig farm was next door to us, and the pigs would get out and run into our yard. My grandparents lived at the top of that hill, and aunts and uncles and cousins. And it was the road was in such bad shape when it snowed or when it rained, you couldn't get out. But people relied on each other. My grandpa would kill the prize hog and give meats. We would shovel people out, and so it was the camaraderie and fellowship on that street that it was named after. And so the irony of that, that I was called the N-word walking home on that street, and this refrain that you don't belong here, really forced me to think about that. When Trayvon Martin was murdered, President Obama said that it could have been his son. Well, I said it could have been my nephew. He looked just like my nephew, who my sister bought my grandfather's pig farm, built her house there, and my nephews live there now. And so I could see them riding their bikes up and down that street. And I would think about me being called the N-word. And I would think about Trayvon Martin. And I wanted to protect them. I wanted to build a wall that was big enough to protect them. I wanted to collect all of the guns that were big, strong enough to protect them. I wanted to build a moat that was deep enough to protect them. And I realized that that none of those things were going to protect them. That the only thing that actually would protect them was for me to introduce you to my nephew, for you to introduce me to your nephew, and for us to be proximate enough that we might plant the seeds of trust, that we might develop shared values, that we might expand the circle of people that we feel responsible for, that we might build a community that's imbued with the ideas of dignity and value and worth and belonging. And so, perhaps as a personal motivation, I was told that I didn't belong somewhere, and for the rest of my life, I'll try and build spaces where other people feel like they belong.
Thank you so much.
We have about 15 minutes for your questions. Again, if you have a question, if you could direct it to this microphone here or to the microphone on the other side of the room. Okay, if you want to ask another question while people jump up and run to the microphones.
I absolutely do. I pulled a quote that you said. I watched about 7 of his interviews about the book, and then I started reading all the interviews with you. And this quote stuck with me because it's about Obama, but it's about the way you see the world. And you said, I believed in this idea where there weren't red states and blue states. There were the United States. The beautiful thing about that is that it was a rally cry for people to come together and support that idea. How do we get back to this idea that it's not half of a red country and half of a blue country, but that it's all of us together trying to make this country work?
I'm going to filibuster with this answer because I see Lester Spence, Tanguy, Dr. George. These are going to be some hard questions. This was my professor in college, y'all, and so I know what's about to. So I'm going to use up the remainder of my time. You might as well sit down, brother. No, I'm kidding. This idea of this is the core idea that when we talk about these 3 churches coming together, one of the things that moved me in reflecting on it is that I didn't see it. Right? So my grandmother's telling me the story, these 3 churches merged the night that Dr. King is assassinated, and I interrupt her and I say, that didn't happen. Those 3 churches didn't merge, did they? She was like, you dummy, of course they merged. It's where you were baptized. It's where you went to Sunday school. It's the church that you grew up in. And so there's something about the polarization that you're talking about that we live through right now that didn't allow me to see the church that I grew up in, to understand that it was created, it was intentionally forged, and that which is intentionally created must be intentionally kept. And so the thread that runs through this book is that if those things are important to us, then it is our responsibility to make them. My uncle in the book, he talks about how after the church is after the church is desegregated, you might walk into a sanctuary and see all of the white congregants on the left and all of the black congregants on the right. There were people who raised their hands to go and sit in between. there's a performative component to this. There's a muscle memory. We gotta force it until it's natural. I don't know that I would have raised my hand to go, how awkward would that have been to go and sit in between? But it's that kind of dedication. It's that kind of intention. It's hard to hate up close when we're real proximate, when we're hearing each other's stories, right? When we understand the values, when we can live in each other's empathy, like that's actually how. And we have to have people who are talking about that. We have to have leaders who are calling us to be a part of that. We have to have, in all spaces, in our political space, sure, but also in our civic space and in our business space, to say that these are the values that we need, that we believe in, that we can all rally behind to bring this country to a new place.
And so we'll push it out. Dr. Spence?
Thank you. And my joking thing was I could still change your grade. But so we're living in a different moment. So for folk who study this like I do, we now no longer live in a liberal democracy. The term is one of competitive authoritarianism. If you think about, one way to think about it is like you just take the corruption and the deep racism and the political dynamics that characterized Jim Crow, it now arguably increasingly categorizes the entire country. How do you take the meso and the micro level dynamics you're talking about, that interpersonal engagement, and scale that in conditions like this?
Yeah. Be wary of that word scale, because I think it is it's an easy out. I was in San Francisco doing a talk 2 weeks ago. So I was in Silicon Valley, and I was like, I blame you for this, because they're always talking about scale. Should we have a business if it doesn't scale? Should we have an idea if it doesn't scale? Absolutely. If I'm talking about the work that, I can bring this back to Pleasant View. I can bring this back to a decision that my great-great-grandparents made in 1868. They were going to pool together $54. They were going to buy 3 acres of land, that they were going to build a schoolhouse and a church and a cemetery and a social hall. I don't think they asked, is this idea going to scale? They asked, do our kids need education? They asked, where will we worship? They asked, how will we commune? Where will we bury our dead? There isn't anyone else coming, and I think that there isn't anyone else coming theme sort of resonates very deeply. They recognized the existential nature of it, and they recognized that they needed to build it. And I was the person who would have said, stop, scale, let's risk mitigate the hell out of this, let's give you some other options. I think what Dr. Spence is saying is other options are off the table. We have to think about, like that church thought about in 1968, recognizing the existential moment. They just say, we're going to have some new partners. We're going to build some new relationships, right? The decision to merge with a Methodist congregation that was historically white, northern and southern. We had to do some asset evaluation. What are we good at? What are our liabilities? What are you good at? What are your liabilities? Where when we come together? What are we actually going to build together? And I feel like that's it. We have to understand, as you framed, that this is not just an era of change, that this is a change of era. And so what are the new relationships? What are the new institutions that we're prepared to build to move it forward?
It's coming up on 8 o'clock, so we'll take our final 2 questions on that side.
So I'll try to be brief. So not quite the scale, but still pushing a little bit, right? So if community requires proximity, how do you get others to see folks' humanity when they're not proximate, right? So that's not about scale, is can you see others as part of a community without sort of affinity and proximity? And then I have one more question, sorry. About archival research, I was wondering, how did you navigate the contestation between sort of what the family accepted history is versus what the archives say that they are, and what were the tensions there or any tensions with the family?
Great. We're going to take them both, yeah. The doctor.
Hey, you share a story in the book about the family land that ended up having to be decided upon, and that created some conflict. But then you also added how your grandmother, and I believe maybe it was her sister, were still there. Like, they had a conflict, but yet she was still by her bedside.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what can that teach us about community. While we can be in conflict, we can disagree about things, but yet still be by each other's bedside and support each other.
Beautiful and related, I think. So let me start with this idea of tension that was present in both of your questions. I was very nervous when this book came out, because this book is, as much as it's about community, it's an interrogation of my relationship to community. Right, the community that I inherited, right, this Pleasant View, the community that I chose in Washington University, in St. Louis, the community that I chose in serving Barack Obama. And then after George Floyd's murder, I felt the need to interrogate this community, but it was also interrogation of relationships with my family, right? It was necessary to show that this church merger happened in a community that had a history of slavery, that had a history of racial segregation, and had a history of racial terror. It was also important to show that this family surely ain't perfect, that we have our elements of tension. And you read about my relationship with my Uncle Vernon, you read about my relationship with my cousin Melvin, you read about my relationship with my Aunt Esther. Because I want you to connect to those stories. I want you to connect to those people. And the quick version of what Dr. James is talking about is that my aunt sued my grandmother over land. And I took that personally. And I distanced myself from my aunt. I attributed the end of the Christmas dinners and the Easter dinners to the fact that my aunt sued my grandmother over some communal land. And then one day I walk into my grandmother's hospital room, and there's Aunt Esther, sitting there on the edge of the bed, thick as thieves, just chuckling it up. And she says, "Oh, we're going to go to lunch. Do you want to come?" I was like, I've been harboring all these feelings, this distrust, this distance, and there they are, sisters. This Sunday, my Aunt Esther came up to me. She said, "Jason, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you about this book that you wrote." She said, "I don't agree with everything you said and the way you framed everything, but that part that you put in there about me and my sister," she said, "that's just how we did it. You might disagree, but you're family. And we love each other." And I think that's an important lesson on tension. And ultimately, it's also the tension that you saw sort of in archival history. There's a story about ultimately we had to ask every member of the family who was there when I presented our family history how they felt, what they felt connected to, what they didn't agree with, what they agreed with. But then we got to what do we hope to see for the future, right? And so it's the opportunity to hear all of those pieces out, the opportunity to actually engage. And that's also this point about proximity. I don't think proximity necessarily is physical. It doesn't have to be physical, right? This is why we tell the story, because the story can engage populations and people that I may never meet. But it tells a rich and a compelling and a personal story. That's the only way that we ever connect. It's the only way that we've ever moved. I mentioned Emmett Till. Right? Like, that's the power of a story. The fact that Mamie Till decided to leave an open casket, right? That's the power of a message. It's the power of a story. Those people never met. When you think about what happened at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that's a story. Right, that was conveyed and captured and moved a nation. And so it's the power of story and really our responsibility to tell the stories and keep telling the stories, to not just brush these things off. I think love sometimes looks like accountability, where we have a responsibility to say, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be like this. And let me tell you a different story. And let me tell you a different way that this can actually be.
All right, thank you so much, Jason Green.
Can I say one thing? Dr. K, everybody. I did want to just give one shout out to what's up behind us. So I mentioned that Pleasant View, we're going to celebrate 158 years this Saturday. You are all invited. Come out and join us. This is in Quince Orchard, Maryland. It's going to be a wonderful celebration. And I also wanted to highlight the QR code that's here. If you want to stay in touch with us, with the book, understand where it's going and the message that we're having across the country, please just shoot us a message through the QR code and we can stay connected. I'm deeply grateful. Thank you so much for being here.
Again, please help me to thank tonight's moderator, Cassandra Wise-Whitehead. And before he runs off, don't run off, tonight's author, Jason Green. We'll be outside in about 5 minutes. Jason will sign your book, take some photos, and talk some more. Thanks again for coming out.